What if I tell you that deep inside the quiet corridors of the Cold War, a single man forced the mighty Soviet machine to burn its own secrets before anyone else could steal them, and that the way he did it still shakes the intelligence world today? Imagine a place where silence carries more weight than words, where every footstep echoes with suspicion, where the very air feels trained to listen. It was inside that atmosphere, under a dim and watchful light, that one anonymous figure began to play a game that no one understood until it was too late. The Cold War was not a battlefield of tanks and soldiers, but a war of whispers, shadows, and decoded fragments. In those years, the smallest gesture could ignite suspicion. The slightest pause could trigger a silent alarm in the mind of a trained operative. And in the middle of that trembling balance, there existed one man whose name rarely appears in public archives, yet whose decisions forced entire Soviet departments to retreat into chaos. You hear the faint hum of an old ventilation system. You sense a dry chill running along the corridor floor. Somewhere behind a thin concrete wall, a typewriter clacks, once, then stops, as if the typist suddenly questioned whether the room was truly empty. The man at the center of this story walked through spaces like this every day. He learned how to let his footsteps blend with ambient noise, how to turn pages soft enough that no listening device caught the friction of paper against paper. He had a craft, a subtle discipline, an ability to become unseen even when standing in the center of a room. His mission began with something almost ordinary, a small classified document misplaced, or at least that is how the Soviets interpreted it at first. A missing file is not a crisis. It happens. People misplace folders. People shake off long nights with mistakes. But this man knew exactly how fear grows in an institution built on secrecy. He understood the psychology of suspicion. He knew that the greatest weapon was not the theft of information, but the suggestion that information might already be stolen. One night, the building lights flickered with a quiet pulse. A distant elevator door sighed shut. The smell of dusty fabric and aging leather drifted through a clean but cold hallway. Inside an intelligence archive room, a single drawer was left open by only the width of a fingertip. It looked unimportant. It looked like an accident. Yet it was the first stone dropped into a silent lake. The next morning, a supervisor noticed the drawer. He stood there motionless, listening to the room as if the walls might whisper their explanation. Nothing. Just the faint ticking of a desk clock and the muffled sound of a guard shifting his weight outside the door. That open drawer grew heavier by the second. It pulled at the mind. It provoked questions. Why would someone access that particular file? Who needed it? Who dared to touch what should remain sealed? When the file inside the drawer was checked, every page was accounted for, every classified detail in its place. Yet something felt wrong, something intangible, something that made the supervisor swallow hard while scanning the room with slow, narrow breaths. And that feeling was precisely what the mysterious man wanted to create. From that moment onward, the quiet tension inside the Soviet office began to bloom. Officers spoke with tighter voices. Guards kept their eyes sharper. Doors that usually stayed cracked open now closed with the softness of velvet, yet the certainty of steel. In this world, suspicion could grow like vines in darkness. And the man who controlled that fear never needed to touch another document. He only needed to let the Soviets believe someone already had. That single open drawer was the beginning. It planted doubt. It whispered paranoia. It told an entire intelligence division that someone inside their walls could pass through the night unnoticed. that their secrets might not be as sealed as they believed. What the Soviets did not know was that this was only the first move. And far beyond that dimly lit archive room, the man was already planning his second. The air tightened. The atmosphere shifted. Something was coming, and the next event would not simply unsettle them. It would make them burn their own secrets. The days that followed did not bring answers. They brought something stranger, a spreading discomfort that moved through the building like a quiet draft, creeping under every office door. Even the guards posted outside the archives felt it. They stood a little straighter. They blinked a little slower, as if listening for something they could not describe. No one admitted fear, yet everyone sensed the invisible tremor in the air. Inside that uneasy silence, the man made his next move. It happened in a room that rarely saw visitors. A small records office tucked behind a narrow hallway that smelled of old paper and stale dust. The faint hum of fluorescent lights flickered in irregular rhythms that almost felt like coded signals. A desk with scratched corners sat beneath a window coated in fog from the winter cold outside. On that desk rested a ledger, ordinary, unremarkable, yet he knew its psychological weight. He approached it with measured calm. The room seemed to listen to him. His fingers hovered above the ledger without touching it at first. He let the moment breathe. He allowed the air to settle in a way that would feel unsettling to anyone who entered later. Then he opened the ledger to a page that contained nothing sensitive, a harmless list, an inventory of blank stationery. He tore out that page with slow, deliberate care. Not enough to create a clear crime, not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to plant another seed of uncertainty. He placed the torn page on the floor near the door, not centered, not obvious, just barely visible if someone walked past with a distracted glance. He knew that subtlety carries more power than bold action in a place governed by fear. A missing page in a harmless ledger means nothing, but a missing page discovered near an entrance speaks a different language. It suggests movement. It hints at intrusion. It whispers that someone who should not be here has stepped into this room. Hours later, the clerk assigned to the records office entered with sleepy eyes and a sluggish gait. He rubbed his hands together against the cold and shut the door behind him with a soft drag. At first he noticed nothing unusual. The window fogged, the lamp flickered, the papers rested where he left them. But when his foot brushed against something light, he glanced down and froze. The torn page rested against his boot. His breath caught at the back of his throat. The room felt smaller suddenly. He scanned it slowly. The coat rack, the cabinet, the empty chair. Nothing looked touched. Nothing looked stolen. Yet something inside whispered that someone had been in this room while he slept at home. He picked up the torn page and held it between trembling fingers. He did not understand why his body reacted with tension. He only knew that something was wrong. He checked the ledger and found the missing space where the page used to sit. Harmless content, no classified material. But the fear that flickered inside him was not about the information. It was about the idea that someone had crossed a line. When he reported it to his supervisor, the reaction was predictable. A short conversation filled with tightly controlled breath. A glance toward the hallway as if expecting shadows to listen. And then the order to say nothing to anyone else. But silence does not heal fear. It amplifies it. By noon, the torn page had made its way through whispered conversations behind closed doors. Each retelling added a new flavor of anxiety. Was it carelessness? Was it sabotage? Was it the same person who slipped into the archive room? No one said these questions aloud, yet every mind echoed them. The man who orchestrated this knew exactly how an intelligent structure responds to uncertainty. No system built on control tolerates mystery. The human mind inside such a system tries desperately to fill the blank spaces with logical explanations. But when the logic fails, something darker forms. A suspicion that grows heavier with each passing hour. Some officers avoided eye contact. Others watched the building entrances with an intensity that revealed their shaken discipline. Meanwhile, the man walked among them as unnoticed as drifting dust. He never hurried, never lingered. He breathed the same cold air, heard the same distant murmurs, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that fear was now doing half his work for him. That night, the corridors felt colder than usual. A guard heard faint footsteps, but saw nothing when he turned. Another guard swore he caught the scent of old tobacco smoke, though no one in the building smoked anymore. The building itself seemed unsettled, as if the walls retained the tension of the people inside. The torn page was only a test, a whisper before the storm, and deep inside the structure of Soviet intelligence, the first cracks had begun to form. The next move would widen those cracks. The next move would not simply unsettle them. It would make them question every person they worked beside, and it would bring them closer to the moment when they would decide to burn their own secrets. The shift in the building mood was subtle at first, like a quiet shiver traveling through the bones of the structure. But by the third day, something unspoken had taken hold. Conversations shortened. Chairs scraped the floor more quietly. Even the habitual coughs of aging officers seemed to fade into controlled silence. Suspicion now lived inside the bloodstream of the building, pulsing with every exchanged glance. One officer in particular felt it more sharply than the others. His name was not important to the records, yet his presence carried a gravity that made younger analysts straighten their posture when he entered a room. He was seasoned, stern, and disciplined in the way only long service under the Soviet intelligence command could shape a man. And for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar rising inside him. Doubt. He sat inside a narrow surveillance room, lit by a single tired lamp. The warm glow touched only his hands, and the thick reels of the recorder spinning with a soft whisper. Beyond the small circle of light, the room dissolved into darkness, broken only by the faint outline of shelves stacked with tapes. The air felt heavy, not warm, not cold, just burdened, as though it carried the weight of secrets no one wanted to voice. He leaned forward, listening to the playback of hallway audio recorded the previous night. Footsteps, soft, slow, almost cautious. Then a pause, a breath, the subtle drag of fabric brushing a wall. None of it matched the scheduled patrol routes. None of it matched the rhythm of any known officer. Yet it was not enough to identify anyone. The recording was too vague, too shadowed by ambient noise. He stopped the reel, and the room fell into a deeper quiet. Somewhere above him, a vent rattled with cold air. A distant elevator door opened and closed with a dull thud. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the musty scent of old tape and electrical dust. The feeling inside his chest tightened. It was not fear exactly. It was the knowledge that something was approaching, and whatever it was did not belong within these walls. Across the building, the mysterious man moved with the same fluid calm he always carried. He felt the tension thickening, felt the unease multiplying with every question that went unanswered. The cracks were widening faster now. Trust was weakening, and he was ready to push it further. His next act did not require entering a restricted room or handling sensitive documents. It required something far more subtle. He understood that in a place run by strict routines, a disruption to those routines could strike the mind harder than any physical breach. He slipped into a storage room rarely checked. The air tasted dry with old cardboard and the lingering scent of machine oil. A single weak bulb hummed overhead, casting trembling shadows that stretched across crates filled with unused communication equipment. He approached a set of sealed boxes labeled for internal maintenance and reached into one of them, removing a small device. Not dangerous, not valuable, but recognizable enough to trigger questions. He placed the device on a shelf where it did not belong. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet displacement of something that should have remained untouched. Then he stepped back, letting the silence swallow the act. Hours later, a maintenance officer entered the room for inventory checks. He scanned the shelves with sleepy indifference until his eyes landed on the device that did not match the rest. He frowned, leaning closer. His fingers tapped the metal casing, feeling the cold surface. He whispered something under his breath, a small sound swallowed immediately by the stale air. He checked the inventory sheet. The device was listed as sealed, yet here it was, resting openly, as if someone had taken it out, examined it, and left it behind without care. His pulse quickened. He stood still for several seconds, listening. Nothing. Only the faint groan of building pipes. He lifted the device with a cautious grip. It left a small ring of dust on the shelf where it had rested, a silent marker proving it had been moved recently. And that was enough. Enough to raise a flag. Enough to stir fear. Enough to send whispers traveling through the corridors long after he reported it. Meanwhile, the seasoned officer in the surveillance room reviewed the newest report with tightened eyes. He rubbed his forehead, tracing the lines carved by decades of service. Something was happening, something deliberate, something that grew stronger with each small disruption. He returned to the reel, pressing the button again. The soft crackle filled the room. Footsteps, a breath, a pause. Then a faint click, a door latch. But whose door? And why had no one reported leaving their post? He leaned closer until the warm light brushed his cheek. The sound repeated. A click, a very controlled motion. Someone practiced. Someone who understood silence as a tool. He replayed it again. And again. Each time the atmosphere around him seemed to tighten, as though the walls themselves leaned in to listen. A thought surfaced in his mind. A thought he did not want. A thought that made the back of his neck prickle with a cold shiver. Someone inside this building was orchestrating these events, and they were doing it with precision. He pushed his chair back slowly, the legs scraping softly against the floor. He stared into the dim corner of the room where shadows thickened like smoke. For the first time, he sensed that he was not merely observing a disturbance. He was becoming part of it. And the man behind the unfolding tension had already chosen his next target. The next move would not be a missing page or a shifted device. It would strike deeper. It would strike at the fragile trust inside the chain of command. It would make colleagues look at each other with quiet suspicion. And once that happened, the fire would be ready. All he needed was a spark. By the next morning, the building no longer felt like an intelligence center. It felt like a living organism growing tighter around its own fears. Every doorway felt narrower. Every corridor seemed longer. The air hummed with quiet anxiety that settled into every corner like dust. People spoke with lowered voices. Others spoke even less. And when a chair creaked or a drawer shut, a few faces would turn with a silent question hidden inside their eyes. A mandatory briefing was called. Rare, unexpected, and poorly timed. Officers and analysts gathered in a windowless underground room where the walls carried the faint smell of damp concrete. The long fluorescent tube above flickered in an irregular pulse that made the shadows jump like restless silhouettes. Metal chairs scraped across the floor as people took their seats. The sound echoed louder than it should have, as if the room itself felt uneasy. When the senior supervisor entered, he carried a thin folder tucked under his arm. His posture was rigid, his breath shallow. The lines around his eyes looked deeper than usual. He did not sit. Instead, he placed the folder on the steel table and let the silence settle like cold fog before he spoke. His voice was low, controlled, yet beneath it lurked an unmistakable strain. He informed the room of unexplained disruptions. Nothing major, nothing confirmed, but irregular enough to warrant attention. A missing page, a shifted device, a noise pattern on a surveillance tape. Small things, too small for panic, yet somehow heavy enough to make the walls feel closer. He emphasized that no one was under suspicion, a lie that everyone recognized yet obediently pretended to accept. His eyes moved over the room slowly, resting on each face with a searching intensity. He lingered a heartbeat longer on officers who seemed tense, then on officers who seemed too calm. The silence between his words stretched like a drawn-out breath. One analyst shifted in his seat, and the metal chair squealed softly, breaking the stillness. Every head turned toward him. A small moment, a small sound, yet it reflected the fragile state of the room. The supervisor cleared his throat and continued, but the message was already delivered without words. Someone among them might be responsible. The mysterious man stood near the back of the room, blending into the dimmest patch of shadow. He listened without expression, though inside him a quiet satisfaction formed. The tension he planted had grown far beyond the seeds he scattered. The collective mind was now doing more damage than any single act could achieve. He studied the faces around him. The flickering light gave them a ghostly quality. Some eyes darted nervously. Some stared straight ahead with stiff resolve. A few stole careful glances at colleagues, measuring them with suspicion. He breathed in the cold dampness of the room, feeling the pulse of unease tighten with every minute. The supervisor finally opened the thin folder. Inside were short reports, each no longer than a few sentences. He read them out loud. He did not describe them as evidence, only irregularities. Yet the way he paused between each report felt deliberate, as though he wanted each detail to settle heavily on the minds listening. A faint click echoed from the hallway outside. A door latch, very soft, almost nothing. Yet every person in the room heard it. Every head turned instinctively. The supervisor tensed. The man in the shadow remained still, watching the reaction ripple through the group like a cold current. The door did not open. No footsteps followed. It was only the sound of metal shifting under pressure. But in a building already crawling with paranoia, even the smallest unexplained noise carried a sharp edge. The meeting did not last long after that. The supervisor dismissed everyone with controlled calm, though his fingers trembled slightly as he closed the folder. Officers rose from their chairs in slow, uneven movements, creating a mixture of cautious silence and hurried footsteps. The air felt heavier on exit than it had on arrival. In the corridor outside, the atmosphere tightened even more. Conversations ended before they began. People looked over their shoulders. Others pressed their identification badges to their chests, as if shielding them. The man walked among them with the steady, quiet presence of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere. He made no effort to hide his calm. Sometimes calm creates more fear than aggression, especially in places where everyone else struggles to keep their breathing steady. When he reached the upper level of the building, he paused by a small window overlooking the courtyard. He watched a guard pacing below. Each step left a faint crunch on the icy pavement. The guard glanced upward as though sensing unseen eyes, but saw nothing. The man stepped away and moved toward a room fewer people dared to check, a place where routine rarely reached, a place where his next move would take shape. Not an object this time, not a misplaced scrap, something deeper. He planned to disturb not the building, but the trust that held its people together. A single shift in perception could change everything, and he was ready. The spark he needed was almost within reach. All he had to do was let the right person find the wrong clue. Evening settled over the building like a slow-moving cloud. The light through the windows dimmed into a pale gray that made every shadow feel longer, sharper, more intrusive. Officers finished their shifts with tightened movements, locking drawers as if afraid unseen hands might open them again. Whispered conversations faded into cold silence. The place felt less like a secure facility and more like a mind unraveling from within. The seasoned officer from the surveillance room walked the corridor with heavy steps. His mind was cluttered with questions he could not organize. Each report he reviewed raised the same unspoken fear. Someone inside these walls was dismantling their sense of security, one small disturbance at a time. He felt it in the murmurs behind doors, in the stiff posture of guards, in the shrinking confidence of junior analysts. The entire building breathed irregularly, like a patient trying to hide an internal injury. He reached the records vault, a room protected by thick steel and an outdated yet dependable locking mechanism. He unlocked it slowly, listening to the soft metallic clicks that echoed through the quiet hallway. The door opened with a sigh of stale air. The faint scent of old paper brushed his senses, mixed with the metallic tang of cold steel. Inside the vault, the atmosphere felt heavier than he remembered. The rows of cabinets stood unmoving like silent witnesses. The only light came from a small desk lamp left on by someone earlier. Its warm amber glow created a fragile circle of safety surrounded by darkness. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, the sound ringing louder than he intended. He approached the table, letting his fingers brush the edges of the metal surface. Scratches marked its history, marks left by decades of hands searching for secrets. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him. Somewhere above, the faint hum of the ventilation system trembled like a nervous whisper. He reached for a particular cabinet. Archive 14, a place that stored internal correspondence, nothing classified enough to warrant tampering. Yet something drew him there tonight. A quiet instinct, a sense that this room held a clue buried in the calm. He opened the drawer. Folders sat in tidy rows, uniform, unremarkable. But as he ran his finger along the top edges, he felt a slight misalignment in the sequence. One folder sat a fraction lower than the rest. A tiny detail, the kind of detail most people would overlook, but not him. He pulled the folder free. The weight felt ordinary. The cover carried the soft wear of age. He opened it carefully. The documents inside looked untouched. Pages crisp, aligned, precise. Nothing missing, nothing added. Yet something felt wrong. A faint disturbance that prickled at the back of his mind. He closed the folder and brought it under the lamp. The warm light revealed a small detail he had not noticed. A faint streak of dust missing from the side of the cabinet where the folder had been stored. a thin, clean line amid the otherwise even layer of settled dust. Someone had moved this folder recently. He swallowed hard. His breath trembled. This was no accident. Someone had entered this vault without authorization. Someone had touched these files. Someone had stood exactly where he stood and left no clear evidence except a break in the perfect consistency of dust. He placed the folder back, aligning it precisely. Then he stepped back from the drawer, turning slowly as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. The vault was silent, the air unmoving. Yet he felt watched, not by cameras, not by guards, by something more personal, something patient. Meanwhile, the mysterious man lingered in another part of the building, aware that the discovery had been made. He had left the clue deliberately. Not enough to confirm guilt, not enough to make accusations, just enough to tighten the tension further. He knew how fear grows when it has no shape, when it cannot be traced, when it hides behind ordinary objects. In the vault, the officer closed his eyes for a moment. The silence pressed against him like a weight. His mind raced through possibilities. Was the intruder seeking something valuable, or were they creating the illusion of intrusion for reasons unknown? The uncertainty scraped at his nerves. Then he noticed something else, a faint coldness in the air, the kind that follows an open door, and near the floor a thin line of disturbed dust leading toward the far corner of the room. Barely visible, yet unmistakable. Someone had moved through this vault with care. Someone had walked exactly where that faint trail led. He followed it slowly. His shoes moved across the floor with quiet, controlled steps. The air seemed colder near the corner, the light dimmer, the dust more unsettled. When he reached the end of the trail, he found nothing. No object, no discarded scrap, only a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as though someone had stood there long enough to leave their presence behind. He felt a shiver crawl along his spine. Someone was orchestrating a pattern he could not yet see, a pattern built to unsettle, to fragment trust, to turn colleagues into suspects. He left the vault with the uneasy knowledge that something deeper was unfolding, something designed with patience, something that fed on silence. And somewhere in the building, the man who engineered it all waited for the next moment to strike. Not with noise, with absence. Absence always carries the sharpest fear. The stairwell was colder than any office or vault. It smelled of damp concrete, rusting metal, and the faint trace of cigarettes long extinguished. Each step the officer took echoed quietly, yet it felt louder than it should have, as if the walls themselves listened. He hesitated at the landing, the faint hum of distant machinery vibrating in his chest. The building was breathing differently tonight. Alive, alert, suspicious. He was not supposed to be here. Not alone. Not after hours. Yet instinct guided him down the narrow stairwell. Something in the pattern of the missing page, the shifted device, the disturbed folder, had seeded a suspicion that demanded investigation. A pattern he could feel, but not yet name. Every corridor, every stair, every shadow seemed to whisper his name, urging him forward and warning him back at once. His gloved hand brushed the railing. Cold metal kissed his fingertips. Tiny flecks of dust clung to the leather. A scrap of paper shifted underfoot. His pulse quickened. Nothing else moved. Nothing else should. And yet he felt an awareness behind him. A presence just out of reach, patient, quiet, invisible. It was not the building. It was not his colleagues. It was something else. Someone else. The stairwell turned sharply, funneling him into a narrower passage. Shadows pooled here, thick and deep. He could barely make out the contours of old maintenance doors along the walls. Behind each door he imagined secrets hidden, secrets that no one should ever touch. And he felt, somewhere deep in his mind, that tonight a boundary had already been crossed, that secrets were no longer secure simply because the folders remained closed. At the bottom, the final landing revealed a small access door. He had never noticed it before. Its metal surface was scratched, paint-chipped, hinges faintly corroded. A cold draft seeped through its frame, carrying with it the scent of oil, dust, and something faintly metallic. He pressed his ear against it. Nothing. Only the distant hum of electrical panels and the faint rhythmic breathing of a guard far down the hallway. He hesitated. Every instinct screamed caution, yet curiosity outweighed fear. He twisted the handle slowly. A click resonated softly. The door resisted for a moment before swinging open just enough to reveal a narrow maintenance crawl. A faint glimmer of light flickered inside, barely visible. The air smelled older here, older and heavier, like time had collected in this space, waiting for someone to disturb it. He stepped inside, every movement deliberate. The floor grated under his shoes. Dust swirled with each breath. His flashlight illuminated a narrow corridor lined with pipes and cables. Shadows stretched unnaturally, distorted by the flickering light. He felt an almost imperceptible vibration beneath his feet, like the building exhaling. His eyes darted along the walls, noting each imperfection, each scratch, each subtle clue left by unseen hands. Ahead, a faint flicker suggested movement, not full motion, a shadow that did not belong. He froze. His gloved hand tightened around the railing. Every sound became amplified, the scrape of metal, the hum of electricity, the distant cough of a guard, and then a whisper, not audible, not spoken, but something that grazed the edges of his consciousness. He knew, without seeing, that he was being observed. The hallway curved. The shadow vanished. Yet the feeling persisted. The presence was not aggressive. It was deliberate, patient, calculating. The officer realized he was not simply investigating anomalies. He had become part of the pattern, a piece of the design itself. And in that moment, he understood the terrifying scope of what the mysterious man had orchestrated. Above him, the building settled with a soft creak. A faint clatter echoed from the upper floors, almost like a door closing in the distance. The sound carried down through the stairwell and the crawl space. It was a simple motion, unnoticed by most. Yet here, in this isolated descent, it felt like a signal, a marker, a message delivered silently to a select few. The game was far from over. He moved deeper, guided by instinct and fear. The air grew colder, heavier. Each step carried him further from safety, closer to knowledge, or perhaps closer to uncertainty. Somewhere along this path, the invisible operator was watching, waiting, and pulling the threads of trust apart with surgical precision. Every small disruption he had created until now was nothing compared to the tension that would be unleashed in the coming hours. The officer paused, breath visible in the icy air. He realized that the vaults, the papers, the devices, and the torn page were not the true target. They had been distractions, misleading breadcrumbs for the mind to follow. The true design was psychological. The trust, the awareness, the very perception of safety inside the Soviet intelligence building was the real battleground. He pressed forward, every sense alert, every shadow a potential witness, every sound a coded message. And somewhere above, the orchestrator of this intricate tension smiled quietly, knowing that the next move would force his adversaries to question not only what they knew, but who they were. The stairwell ended. Ahead, a final hatch opened onto the cold, silent floor of the maintenance wing. The officer stepped into the gray light. The air smelled faintly of oil and dust, tinged with anticipation. He had descended into the unknown, and the mysterious man, unseen and patient, had prepared the stage for the moment when the walls themselves would betray their occupants. And that moment was approaching. The operations room was quiet, almost eerily so. The usual chatter of analysts had been replaced with a heavy, expectant silence. Every chair sat slightly askew, as if its occupant had left mid-motion and never returned. The faint hum of the overhead lights buzzed with a tension that seemed to make the walls themselves shrink. The room had become an arena of paranoia, and everyone inside was both the audience and the participant. The seasoned officer entered cautiously. His eyes scanned the tables, the scattered maps, the old analog devices left in careless arrangement. Dust floated in the thin beams of light, twisting and drifting as though alive. Every sound was magnified. His own breathing, the soft scrape of his shoes on the worn floor, the faint vibration of an electric fan. He knew he was being watched, yet could see nothing. That awareness alone was enough to heighten every nerve in his body. He moved toward a central table littered with reports and loose papers. Each sheet carried information, some trivial, some potentially sensitive. He bent over one map, studying the faint pencil marks. Routes, checkpoints, surveillance points. Patterns that had been meticulously tracked for months. But even here, something felt out of place. A line misaligned. A route oddly emphasized. Nothing overtly alarming, yet the tiny anomaly gnawed at his mind. He realized he had been drawn here, not by accident, but by design. A creak echoed from the far corner of the room. He froze. The sound of metal against wood. Nothing else moved, yet the silence seemed to amplify the significance of that minor disturbance. He shifted his weight subtly, eyes scanning the shadows. The faint flicker of a monitor caught his attention, a light blinking in an irregular rhythm. Too deliberate to be random. Someone was leaving a message without a signature, a presence without a form. His hands hovered over a scattered pile of papers, brushing them lightly, aligning them, trying to assert control over a space that no longer obeyed logic. And as he did, he felt the psychological trap tighten. Each movement, each observation, carried the weight of unseen scrutiny. He understood now that the mysterious man's true power was not in stealing information. It was in controlling perception, making everyone doubt what they knew, what they saw, even what they felt. He turned slightly, catching a glimpse of a shadow along the far wall. Nothing solid, just a darkness that didn't belong. He stepped closer. The shadow flickered, elongated, then vanished. No one had entered, no one had left. Yet the room felt altered. The balance of trust, precision, and certainty had shifted. It was no longer about documents or devices. It was about fear. The fear that a building full of trained intelligence officers could suddenly feel exposed, vulnerable, and unpredictable. A soft tap sounded near the door. Very soft, easily dismissed, yet it triggered a ripple through the officer's mind. Footsteps outside, a pause, a faint cough, and then silence again. He moved toward the door, each step measured, cautious. The corridor beyond was empty. The ventilation hummed. The shadows stretched in corners, impenetrable. Still, he sensed an invisible presence, someone orchestrating the tension from beyond his sight, just as carefully as a conductor guides a symphony. Back in the operations room, He returned to the map. The subtle anomalies were more apparent now. Lines and symbols that seemed inconsequential now screamed with intent. Someone had manipulated them with patience, with precision, creating a pattern meant to mislead, to provoke doubt, to isolate individuals in their uncertainty. Each officer, each analyst, was being pulled into a psychological labyrinth, a labyrinth designed to make them question everything, even their colleagues. He understood finally that the plan was reaching its crescendo. Small disruptions, seemingly harmless, had accumulated into a growing tension. A web of suspicion had taken root. And now the next act would force decisions. Decisions that would expose weaknesses, reveal fears, and ultimately fracture the unity of the team. The stage was set. The players were unaware, and the man behind it all remained invisible, guiding the unfolding chaos with masterful patience. He exhaled slowly, feeling the oppressive weight of the room pressing against his chest. He realized that the invisible hand manipulating events was not seeking information in the traditional sense. It sought something far more potent: control over the human element. By making officers doubt what they saw and feared what they could not, the orchestrator had weaponized perception itself, and the spark that would ignite the final cascade of events was imminent. Somewhere, unseen, the man prepared the next move, a move that would force the Soviets to act rashly, to burn what they feared could be compromised. The pattern was near completion. Every disruption, every doubt, every whispered suspicion had been calculated to reach this point. The fire was ready, and all it needed was one last touch. Night had fallen over the building, but it was alive in ways most could not perceive. Desks sat untouched, yet every chair seemed to remember recent movement. The faint click of a teletype machine in the distance punctuated the quiet, a rhythm that felt almost predatory. Footsteps echoed in the hallways, yet no one was there. The presence of fear was tangible, like a cold breath on the back of the neck. The seasoned officer returned to the main floor, flashlight cutting through patches of darkness. Each step pressed into the psyche of the building itself, reverberating with the weight of small but deliberate disturbances. A torn page, a displaced device, a subtle misalignment in a folder. These were not mistakes. They were invitations. Invitations to doubt, to question, to fear. And he felt the web tightening around him with every measured stride. At the central desk, the faint glow of a monitor flickered. It displayed nothing but static, yet even static carried meaning in this building. The officer leaned closer, noting how shadows pooled around the edges, how dust swirled gently in a drifting column of light. His gloved fingers hovered above the keys. A soft hum, almost musical, resonated from the monitor. He sensed observation, not mechanical, human, invisible, watching, waiting. He turned abruptly at the faint rustle of paper behind him. Nothing. Just the same empty floor, the same faint moonlight through the blinds. His heartbeat quickened, though no one had spoken. The building itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable misstep. Outside, the wind pressed against the concrete walls, sending tremors through the window panes. Inside, the officer realized that the disruptions he had traced were no longer about stolen information. They were psychological. The mysterious man had crafted an environment where paranoia thrived, where every small anomaly became a seed for distrust. He understood now that one misstep would trigger reactions far more damaging than any act of espionage. He examined the papers on the desk charts, logs, schedules. Everything appeared ordinary. Yet in the subtle shifts, the slight tilt of a map, the faint indentation on a page, he sensed manipulation. Each detail suggested a presence orchestrating these events from shadows. The building's rhythm had been rewritten, every heartbeat and footstep choreographed to provoke tension. He exhaled slowly, brushing his fingers over a teletype sheet. Dust particles danced in the lamplight, creating illusions of movement. He realized that the room itself was a trap, a psychological stage set to fracture the mind. He felt isolated, observed, vulnerable, yet compelled to continue. Somewhere above, the orchestrator prepared the final nudge, the spark that would transform unease into decisive action. The Soviets were poised to overreact, to destroy what they feared had been compromised. The officer could sense the invisible pressure building. The building, the people inside, the silent shadows, all were moving toward a climax he could not yet see. He paused, listening to the soft hum of electricity and the distant shuffle of unseen feet. The tension was nearly unbearable. One false move, one whispered suspicion, one misinterpreted anomaly. It would be enough. And somewhere, the man behind it all remained unseen, patient, smiling quietly at the quiet chaos that was about to ignite. The fire was almost ready. The control room hummed with quiet intensity. Green and amber lights flickered across the surfaces of analog monitors, casting long, jagged shadows across scratched panels. The seasoned officer entered, senses heightened. Every corner of the room felt alive, as though the walls themselves were aware of his presence. The faint hum of the equipment mingled with distant footsteps and soft clicks from the telecommunication lines, creating a rhythm that pulsed through the floor. He approached the main console, where scattered folders and papers sat under dim light. Each item seemed ordinary, yet his experience told him otherwise. The subtle misalignment of a sheet, the slight tilt of a folder, even the way the dust had shifted, all suggested deliberate disturbance. He understood that these small details were not random. They were carefully planted psychological cues, meant to unsettle, to provoke doubt, to force a reaction before any overt action could be taken. The rotary phone on the console rattled softly, though no one had called. The sound echoed through the quiet room. He lifted the receiver slowly. Silence. Yet in that silence, tension thickened, pressing against his chest. Every nerve in his body sharpened. He was not merely observing anomalies anymore. He had stepped into a space designed to manipulate perception itself. His eyes moved over the monitors, each flickering screen offering fragments of information. Nothing seemed alarming at first glance. Traffic patterns, guard rotations, internal communications logs. Yet every detail carried weight, because he now knew someone had calculated the psychological impact of each minor irregularity. The building itself had become a weapon, a tool to fracture trust and provoke errors without a single classified document being compromised. A soft creak behind him made him spin. Empty room. The shadows danced. Dust drifted lazily in the lamplight. He could feel the invisible presence again, watching, waiting. The orchestrator of this tension remained unseen, patient, and deliberate. Each minor act of disruption now converged into a crescendo designed to force a break in protocol. He picked up a folder, running his fingers along the edges, noting subtle fingerprints that were not his own. Someone had been here, manipulating, observing, testing reactions. He realized that these intrusions were not meant to steal information. They were meant to provoke fear, to undermine confidence, to make officers question each other, their routines, their perceptions of safety. The hum of the monitors and faint clicks from the teletype machines merged into a soundscape of suspense. Each minor anomaly had built toward this moment. Every officer in the building, every guard, every analyst was now a participant in an invisible experiment. The subtle psychological pressure was reaching a tipping point. One misstep could trigger panic. One incorrect interpretation could lead to self-destruction of their own secrets. He exhaled slowly. The control room felt smaller, heavier. Each shadow seemed more pronounced. Every light flicker carried meaning. The orchestrator had engineered not just fear, but doubt. And doubt, in a place built on secrecy and trust, is more dangerous than any enemy. Somewhere above, the unseen figure prepared the next move. The Soviets were nearing the point where hesitation, suspicion, and fear would collide. A single spark, delivered carefully, would force them to destroy what they feared was compromised. The room pulsed with the weight of impending chaos. The fire was ready, and in the silence of the control room, the officer understood that he was only seconds away from witnessing it unfold. The moment had arrived. The building held its breath as if aware of the invisible hand that had orchestrated this crescendo. Officers moved with hesitance, glancing at each other with sharpened suspicion. Every glance, every shuffled step, carried weight. The psychological pressure, cultivated over days of subtle manipulations, had reached its peak. The unseen man's design was about to claim its final victory without a single shot fired. In a small office at the far end of the building, papers trembled under the faint draft from a cracked window. The seasoned officer entered cautiously, his senses alert. The files on the desk had been subtly altered. Margins shifted. Marginalia changed. Nothing major. Nothing tangible. Yet it was enough. Enough to trigger doubt. Enough to make even the most disciplined officer question the integrity of their entire system. A lighter flicked in the shadows. A small flame danced across a single sheet. One by one, officers began to follow the trail of suspicion, isolating files they thought were at risk. Hands trembled as papers were stacked and set aflame. The smell of burning ink and paper filled the room. Smoke curled toward the ceiling, twisting and drifting in slow motion. Outside, distant sirens echoed faintly. Inside, the building seemed to pulse with tension, alive with the fire that was both literal and symbolic. The officer watched, understanding at last the full scope of what had been orchestrated. The man had not needed to steal documents. He had not needed to infiltrate further. By carefully manipulating perception, he had made the Soviets destroy their own secrets. Fear and doubt had done the work of any agent. The orchestrator had turned the building into a trap for its own occupants, and he remained invisible. Footsteps receded. Officers cleared rooms, extinguishing fires and muttering under their breath. Yet the aftertaste of unease lingered. Suspicion remained, threaded through every interaction, every glance. Trust, fragile and fragile again, would take years to rebuild. And all the while, the man who had orchestrated it all faded into the night, leaving only a trail of psychological mastery behind him. The seasoned officer stepped out onto the balcony, inhaling the cold night air. The distant city lights shimmered through the fog, oblivious to the silent drama that had unfolded in the building below. He realized that history would remember the files lost, the secrets burned, but it would never trace the unseen hand that had guided it all. Some victories leave no footprints. Some wars are won in the mind. And in that realization lay the chilling truth. In espionage, sometimes the most powerful act is not taking what you want, but teaching others to destroy what they already hold. The room was empty now, smoke curling toward the ceiling, faint shadows dancing along the walls, and the city carried on below. The story of one man who made an empire burn its secrets had ended. Or had it? The next time you feel the weight of uncertainty, the subtle shifts of perception, remember that in the world of intelligence, nothing is ever as it seems. The most powerful manipulations are those you never notice, and the most dangerous secrets are the ones you destroy yourself. If you want to uncover more hidden stories of espionage, betrayals, and psychological warfare that shaped history, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Every story is more shocking than the last, and the truth is stranger than fiction. Don't miss it.